Patrick Kikut has taught at the University of Wyoming's Department of Visual and Literary Arts since 2005. An accomplished artist himself, Patrick works as a painter as well as in three-dimensional forms of art. His work has been widely shown both in the West and further east, such as in New York City. His Square States and Moonscape solo exhibition has been shown in Idaho, New Mexico, and South Dakota. His Manifest Destination, an epic pop song, another solo exhibition, has been shown in Casper and Missoula, while his Remington Residue was shown in California, Montana, and New Mexico. His artworks have also appeared in group exhibitions across the USA and internationally, from Louisiana and Tennessee to Estonia. Patrick is a true Western artist, appreciating the classic studies of Moran and Bierstadt, but basing his work in the modern world. He has used his expertise as an artist of place to collect and mount his current exhibition, Contemporary View of the Arid West, People, Places, and Spaces, an expanded art exhibit through the Arid West. This exhibition brings together work of his own, plus several other artists. One of the places is here in the Sweetwater County Historical Museum, and I hope that you'll go visit it before it closes down, perhaps this afternoon or someday later. It's also appearing at 3 different other places along the Colorado River, and of course the river is the easiest way to get from one exhibit to the other. I traced the overland road route to get to a couple of them from here, and it'll take you much longer, even at 70 miles an hour. So I'd like to ask Patrick to come up and talk about this art exhibit, the Artwork of SCREE, and learn about what the driving vision is behind it and what the kinds of art he has brought together. Patrick.
So I'm going to talk to you about 3 different subjects here. American art history, landscape as a subject, a hero of mine, Tomas Moran, who I continue to think about and learn about. I'm going to talk about myself. I'm a storyteller. And I'm going to talk about my approach to art as well as the approach to this project, which is quite different than the projects that I've taken on in the past. And then some challenges that I see coming up for myself. And then also I want to talk about the SCREE expanded art show, and then go through some of these other artists, examples of their work, and give you an idea of what their plans and what they have contributed to SCREE already. It might be difficult for us to understand here in Wyoming that our landscape is a relatively new subject to art. For for most of art history, and I'm talking about European art history, and I think about it, maybe all art history, different cultures' approaches to art, landscape hasn't been a subject until basically about the 1700s, which is interesting because the 1700s is when the New World really starts to open up and Europeans pour into the New World. So it becomes something that didn't have any meaning. Landscape in art history has just served as a backdrop, as a place where we live and we battle and we kill Christ or do whatever, but it just serves as a kind of a stage set. But something happens in the Baroque period and then later on in the 1700s where people and artists recognize landscape and landscape experiences as holding value. That comes and really ramps up as we're exploring the New World. And so why is landscape important to us in the New World? Well, because we had the New World to depict, and the New World provided us with promises and with meanings. So this painting is a kind of a good one to get started with. It's by John Gast, and it's called American Progress. And not only are all the pioneers moving across the canvas, but on the far, I guess we'll call it the right side of the canvas, you can see the bison moving off the land, as well as the native people making way for the pioneers with the wagons, and then the trains coming right after the wagons. So all of a sudden, this overall landscape, the landscape that we're in now, is something that holds promise and something that holds meaning and something that holds dreams. And the idea was we needed to push west and to populate this area and to make it productive. It was manifest destiny. It was our manifested destiny. So John Gast is a great way to, great image also with the river in there. The thing that when I'm doing more and more research about Tomas Moran and manifest destiny art is the trains we're financing behind everything. This is another example of manifest destiny art by, it's called the Westward, the Course of Empire Takes Its Way by Emanuel Gottlieb Lutz, a German immigrant. And this is a wild scene of all of these pioneers cresting over, I think this might have been an image of like a fantasy of Donner Pass going into California, the promised land. So there it is, California. And I think there's already a little smokestack blowing some pollution into the Grand Canyon right there. I'm not quite sure, but there we go. We're on our way, and landscape has meaning. We're backfilling this landscape. This is an interesting map that Tom Minkley's turned me onto, Humboldt's map, and it's nice to kind of look at this and look at all of what so many people consider flyover space and what an empty, kind of uncharted area we were facing. And Art and Powell definitely had a big role in painting that picture for people on the East Coast and in the South to consider coming out west. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Tomas Moran. Tomas Moran was born in England, came to Philadelphia, worked with his brother who was an engraver, making money, doing illustration. He learned some carving skills from his brother and was working mostly as an illustrator. Pretty much under the radar. He was considered a Hudson River School painter who was, and those painters were up and down the Hudson River, kind of going into northern and western New York and into western part of New England, which at that point was pretty wild. There's a lot of trees and it was the forest. It was the West at that point. Moran was lucky in many ways. One, he was lucky that he spoke English without an accent. His main rival eventually ended up being Albert Bierstadt, who was a German immigrant and was an excellent landscape painter and was already booked by the time Hayden asked Moran to explore Yellowstone with him in 1871, I believe. And so Bierstadt was the first choice and was already busy in California, if you can believe it, working for Huntington, who's a railroad tycoon, and painting paintings in Yosemite. So that's pretty wild. And from my research, also Moran had already been in California before even coming through this country. I'm still a little, or coming in down the canyon. So that's also kind of different. The other fun fact, and I've got fun facts about Moran, is Moran had never ridden a horse before and liked to sit on a pillow. He always rode his mules and horses with a pillow, which a lot of the more seasoned mountain men gave him a hard time for. But he ended up going a long way with that pillow and on that mule. And recently I've found out that Moran didn't spend much time on a boat, which is kind of wild. It's like, I thought I was supposed to be like, if I was truly going to take this trip like Moran, I would be on a mule with Powell kind of cross country over to the Kaibab. I've done a lot of research on Moran. This, even before this expedition was conceived. And this, in the last 2 or 3 years, have given me more chances to dive into the archives of Moran in the Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I've taken a couple trips there and a trip up to Yellowstone Archives, which has a great collection of Moran's artifacts and drawings. The thing that I'm interested in Moran about, not only just his contribution and his work that he produced that helped kind of parallel what Powell was suggesting to Congress as far as protecting landscape, but also I'm really interested in just how he got his work done and his field drawings. And I'll show you some field drawings later. But these were some fun things that you could find in our national park system. This is Moran, whoops, wrong one. This is Moran as a mountain man. This is Moran's handprints that are pretty wild to see. That are he had one hand printed in New York, and then a couple of years later went and had his other hand printed too. So he didn't do them at the same time. This is Moran's flask and his knife, which I think is really cool. And then he brought some firepower with him. And this is my research table at the Yellowstone Archives, which was just so wild to be in the presence of these things. Moran was so effective with his paintings of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that more, but he was then considered Thomas Yellowstone Moran and came up with his signature right there that has a T and an M in it, but it creates a Y in the middle too. So after coming out west, he really kind of embraced this Western traveler role that he was taking. This is a drawing by Moran, but it was a copy. So Moran was making drawings of Yellowstone before he even got out to Yellowstone or got to Green River. And so what he did and what Scribner's Monthly did was they had some drawings that came from an Army survey that happened in Yellowstone, and they were pretty scruffy looking drawings. Little heavy-handed, like a lot of my drawings, and not quite up to the Moran's touch. And so they sent these drawings to Moran, and Moran redefined them and improved them and brought this elegant kind of mist coming off of this waterfall and created more atmosphere. He was more of a impressionist, and that was really seemed to suit the West quite a bit. Tomas Moran worked with J.W. Turner, who was a British painter that was one of the wildest painters of the 1800s, very interested in atmosphere and was pretty much a pre-impressionist. His famous story about Moran's great mentor, Turner, was that he not only liked to experience and look at the landscape, but he liked to feel what it's like. And so I was thinking about Turner yesterday while we were rigging boats and what this feels like more than what this looks like. He actually strapped himself to a mast and sailed out into a storm so he could feel it, get back to his studio and create paintings about what it felt like to be pelted by snow and bad weather. So he would be very great for our SCREE trip here. Scribner's Monthly was new at the time and was starting to broadcast these stories and these images from the West. Not many people really believed these stories though, and this is some new information that I've gained in the last couple of weeks here, and I'll talk to you about what changed there. But one thing I want to tell you about Moran, or observe and show you about Moran, is that I appreciate him for his accuracy and his economy in line. I've visited Moran's archives and looked at his field drawings because they are so beautiful to me in those two things, details and economy. And if you're working outside, that's what you can hope for, is detail with economy. I teach classes and we go out into the Wyoming landscape, and if students are just making drawings of mountains that just look like whatever, I'm like, well, then why the hell are we here? Why are we not in the studio just making stuff up? Why take the effort? Moran is very detailed and specific, especially with scale. If you've never seen a Western landscape, how Moran came out west and got all the scale and the spacing right is a big question. I have a feeling that he was using photographic or visual equipment to help him, but I haven't found any research that supports that. But looking at all his field drawings, I don't see any whiffs on his line, like, oops, I got that wrong. Like, it's always right on the money. You can tell when artists are erasing lines and trying to correct their drawings. And another fun fact I think about Moran from my research into his archives and into his field drawings is I don't think he drew any place more often than Green River, Wyoming. So he's always here because the train's coming here. So he had to get here after the Transcontinental Railroad went through so he could get up to Yellowstone. And then he had to get here a year later to get on the river and start heading south with Powell. So he spent a lot of time waiting here even after those trips, just because that was the route out west. And he's, you know, at this point, Mr. Western Tomas Moran. Beautiful, right? Drawings here. Yeah, that's drawing, hi Florence. That's a drawing with some like gouache. So it's watercolor, gouache, which is sits on the paper a little more heavy and creates those white highlights. So he's working on toned paper with some watercolors, and then that gouache gives that white contrast to it. These are some other examples of his drawings from Yellowstone. Now, the thing that I recently found out about these drawings and why they worked was because of the camera. He was with William Henry Jackson on his trip to Yellowstone, and photography at the time was a relatively new and kind of risky way to document things. Moran was playing backup. They knew he could draw and that he'd be able to produce some drawings. They didn't know how the wet plate thing was going to work out. Right, Bailey? It's always kind of dicey trying to create a dark room outdoors, and with that equipment and with that and the weight of that was a little risky. So Moran played backup and was financed by a railroad tycoon to come out and survey with the Hayden expedition. So the camera actually. So from what I gather, if Moran would have just brought these drawings back to the East Coast, nobody would have believed him. They would have thought he went out west and tripped out in Santa Cruz or something, and don't know what happened. But with the camera, the black and white camera, it freed him up to be like, no, this is it, and I've got color on it. So he could allow his like impressionist kind of color kind of complement what Hayden was doing with the black and white photography. So it actually freed him up. A lot of times you hear that painting's dead, everything's trying to kill painting always, but painting is pretty resilient and always finds a way to be alive. And Moran, it's interesting to think of Moran's career taking off because he's hanging out with these photographers. I never know where to point this thing. There we go. So the famous painting that Moran did to get his career started was the one that Bierstadt first was asked to do. Albert Bierstadt, like I said, was in California painting in Yosemite. He wanted $20,000 for painting for Congress. Moran said, I'll give you one for 10, and was lucky in that. So he spoke good English. He didn't have that heavy German accent. He was half the price and was now off and running into the Western landscape. So he comes back and produces this painting, shows it to Congress along with the photography and along with John Wesley Powell's report to Congress, and eventually is critical in playing a part in starting to protect lands. And we've all probably seen the Ken Burns documentary about how important and wildly radical that was to start to protect landscape, especially after those paintings that we saw in the first part of this presentation, where it looks like it is just like a free market riot scene that's going to happen out west, and everybody gets to take all the trees and the water and the fish and animals. Interesting to kind of pull back and recognize some landscape that's important. One thing also about Yellowstone is that it was really remote, really difficult, and the soil's kind of weird, and you couldn't really farm it. It was just so weird that it's like, okay, we'll protect that landscape. But an interesting thing to think about was when Tomas Moran died in 1923, that there were already 16 national parks developed at that point. So pretty interesting how that took off. It's big, and it's in Congress. I've never seen it. I've never been to D.C.
In the Congress building?
Yeah. Anybody know? Has anybody seen this? We've been invited to go out into that country, hopefully soon, to visit with the USGS. So I'm going to be able to see this first time. That's my big great unknown about Americana is Washington, D.C. details. So I'm hoping to fill that in. So it's a gigantic painting. You can see there's, for scale, there's some folks down here looking over the chasm or the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone. And there's some other details that aren't really showing up in this image, but there's actually a native person facing away and kind of exiting the scene. And then there's also a dead animal kind of in the chasm that looks like it had been fallen or been hunted and fallen into the canyon. So those things are little small details that maybe give a sense of the fate that the West is facing. So with this painting, Tomas Moran is launched into kind of the fame that John Wesley Powell was experiencing and was hot. So he was the hot artist to have at the time. And eventually, what happens with these images is that the railroads really are supporting these kind of efforts, and what they want is images that will complement the stories of the West, the adventures, and also entice people to come take a trip out or maybe potentially homestead the West. So there's all this great railroad imagery that comes in right after Moran's painting, and think about it more and more, how important the railroad is. At the time, it was the cutting edge technology and way to access this great open space. I'm trying to make a comparison that if I was, funded by some technology group or something, what would the comparison would be? And I can't quite come up with it, but imagine that these people had this kind of effort and wanted to have ways to have artists kind of show what's out there, what the promise at the end of the tracks were. So Moran and trains are important. Of course, all of these images, and Moran was not on the first exhibition, as you all probably know, but on the second one. Quickly after Powell went through and survived, most of them survived, he wanted to do it again, and on the second trip he was going to bring artists and scientists to help give this report and help kind of give more scholarship to, rather than just kind of seeing if they could run it. They wanted to go back through and one, make images of it, and two, do a better job of mapping the space. So this is right here in Green River, and we've all seen this photo. And again, I think Moran's on this, but he did not take the boat. This is Tomas Moran, and his photographer, Hillers, I believe, was on the second trip. And this is, of course, Powell, and they're both deep in the canyon at this point. There's not that many field drawings of Moran in the canyon, or there's none besides the Green River area. There's very few that I've found that get anywhere near Desolation Canyon or Dinosaur. Like I said, they crossed the country and kind of hit the canyon going through mostly Utah and down through Zion, where he starts drawing a little bit more. All the photographs I've seen of Powell or of Moran, he's working really closely with his photographer, helping them set up. All the equipment's really heavy, and he doesn't have much time to do his drawing, I'm thinking, but he knows that it's really critical for him to get good images to work on his paintings back on the East Coast. And that's as critical as him just doing field drawings. So I'm excited when I do find a couple of the canyons. And a lot of the drawings that you do see of him, of his work from the canyons, if you look at the dates, they're in the 1910s, 19-teens, and so he starts summering in El Tovar in the summer and has a week every year so he can continue doing his canyon drawings. But those early days, he was really working with really closely with the photographers. Here's an oil study that I think is just beautiful. I didn't bring oil paints with me because it just seemed like too much equipment and not enough time to really set up and do oil studies. The famous painting that complemented Moran's image of the Yellowstone Canyon is this painting called The Chasm of the Colorado. And so this painting is a complement to the Yellowstone, the river, the waterfall, the Yellowstone waterfall painting. And so these two paintings were supposed to hang next to each other with a big painting in the middle. The big painting in the middle that Moran did was called Holy Cross, and it's an image from Colorado. And so it's got the snow in this Holy Cross crack in this mountain, and it kind of is shaped like Mount Moran up in Tetons, where it's just like almost pyramidal. So it would be a triptych with these two canyon paintings in the middle, and then this big kind of Colorado peak in the middle. Those paintings have only been shown all together once, and that was sometime in the 90s. But his dream of having this kind of triptych of paintings all coexist together, he couldn't quite pull that off. But again, he was commissioned by this, to make this painting by the railroads. So the railroads were working really closely in conjunction with westward expeditions and with policy making. Yeah.
Roughly where is this painting located? Where is this scene located?
I think this is the North Rim. That might be, off of Powell Point.
I think so, because you have San Francisco Peaks in the background.
Oh, okay. All right.
Thanks, Tom. And again, right after there's a national park established, then that means people want to access it. The trains are in there, and swooping people into the canyons there. So again, this kind of promotional and tourism industry becomes really strong at that point. And so an interesting thing to think about that I've learned and thought about recently with Moran, I've always had Moran and Bierstadt as two kind of, like Ford and Chevy, or Budweiser and Coors, or Dodgers and the Yankees, or whatever. But, and I've been flipped a little bit, because I always favored Moran I favored his kind of look and his aesthetic, but I also thought that, oh, that's the guy that was all about conservation. And he was the one that painted the painting that, helped establish the national park system. And what I recognize with Moran is that, yes, he did that, but then he continued to paint and take on commissions for the railroad, which ended up helping exploit the Western landscape. Now, Bierstadt, who got left behind on those great trips, ended up making these real interesting and reflective paintings at the end of his life that were more about conservation and more about Buffalo Massacre, and kind of looking already at what Manifest Destiny has left us, let alone Native people. And so it's an interesting switch there where Bierstadt starts taking on more and more kind of content and being more reflective, while Moran kind of keeps making what I consider a lot of times is just being like promotional, like vacational rental homes. Not to take anything away from his work, but he's really trying to sell this place as a promised land. Okay, going back to our work, I want to talk to you about the expanded art exhibit, which was sounded like a great idea, and it is a great idea. I wish I could see it, but we'll be on the river trip. Tom and I had a conversation, and we always like to think about things geographically, and so we thought, yeah, wouldn't it be a great idea as we're floating down the river to have art shows along the river that somebody could drive and take the same path, but in the comfort of a vehicle. I said, yeah, that sounds great, Tom. So from that point of agreeing, and after the eclipse happened, because I was working on the eclipse, I mean, seriously, it was 10 minutes after the moon passed in front of the sun. I was like, oh my God, SCREE, I got to get on to SCREE, because we have to deliver all these artworks before the expedition. So that's been a lot of work, and I'm not just going to make things up. I'm going to have to visit these canyons and visit these places and make field drawings. I work in a very similar way than Moran. Field drawing, refine your field drawing, go to the studio, paint all winter, get back out in the landscape, and continue to research, draw, and take on knowledge of those places. So I've been running up and down the rivers, running on some river trips, but then also spending time with my vehicle making these drawings, and then also wrangling other artists to kind of create this expansive art trip. I wish I could have made a really cool tour guide. Like if I wasn't going to be on this river trip, I could make not only a guide for where all the exhibitions are and talk about that, but all like the side trips you can take to rock art sites or Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, and cool places to get burritos or whatever we need. So that's the expanded art exhibit. It starts, if you're going from Upper Basin to Lower Basin, here in Green River, at the Sweetwater County Museum. The next venue is the Uinta Heritage Museum, and that's in Vernal, Utah. And then after that, there's a kind of a long stretch, and we have artwork at the John Wesley Powell Museum right on the river in Green River, Utah. And then in Page, Arizona, there's a John Wesley Powell Museum, and we have work there as well. The spaces are mostly historical museums and have had to kind of absorb contemporary art in all of its different forms. So it's been fun working with them. Not all the artists that are in the expanded art exhibit are actually going to spend time on the river. So these are the folks that are going to be spending time on the river. And I'll talk a little bit about all of these artists here coming up next. Here's some examples of the exhibit in Green River, Utah. The Green River, Utah is by far the largest space. They have a whole section there just for contemporary art. And we filled it up and had even a little too much work, which was great. I always like to show up to exhibition spaces with just a little more so you can edit some things out. This is Green River as well. This is Dave Jones, who's on the highway now. And here's Bailey Russell. I'll talk about all these artists more deeply here soon. Now, the challenges for me is that I'm used to spending a lot of time by myself out on landscapes like this. This is a project called High Points on the High Plains. I usually try to find locations on the map or that end up being really empty and places that are really easy to camp and to set up and kind of make a space or spend some time and get a feel for a place without too many other people around. This is a high point of Nebraska, I believe. So this is a monument here that actually describes that is on the highest point of Nebraska. If you step 1 foot over, you're in Wyoming or Colorado, I believe. And so it's like on the very western edge of the prairie. I have a trailer like this, so I go and visit these places, spend time there, try to read about the places and make drawings. So this project's quite a bit different because this is such a collaborative project. I'm up here standing and talking to you. I usually spend time by myself in my vehicle or in my studio as a painter. My friends lately have been calling me the cave painter because I barely come out. This is pretty typical. I've always used a sketchbook about this size, and I like the spiral sketchbooks because you can really get into the pages better. And of course you can see how I'm inspired by Moran, not quite there, a little bit heavy-handed, but I like how I'm inspired to use some of his economy there. I usually spend about 10 or 15 minutes with a subject and then move on. I take a photo sometimes if I need it later, but I usually try to build my paintings off of my field drawings like this. This is more typical of the kind of paintings that I produce outside of the SCREE project, and it's always got an interaction between human culture and the natural environment. So there's always a rub there between our encroachment onto landscape and landscape's resilience in a lot of cases. This is outside of Laramie. This boat was stuck in a snowdrift for what seemed like a decade. This is another. These are 5 feet by 10 foot paintings. This is outside of Gallup, New Mexico. Or no.
Did you say 5 feet by 10?
5 feet by 6 feet. So they fit in my vehicle. 5 feet by 6 feet. Again, this is all from a show called Square States and Moonscapes. And it required a lot of travel. I visited all these places. The challenges for me is content or lack of familiar content. Like I said, I've always been interested in places where on the outskirts of town or on the outskirts of a reservation or where there's a rub between nature and culture kind of colliding and grinding together. And I think there's a story there. Tomas Moran and Bierstadt and all those painters from the 1800s did an excellent job producing work that just showed what the Western landscape looked like in a more natural way than we see it now without our heavy impact on it. And I don't want to continue to sell the West as a place that's been untouched. I'm interested in how the conversation or how the rub between our culture and the forces of nature work together. Does that make sense? For my trip that I've taken in the canyons, the leave no trace policy is really strong, and the controls of the flows are so set that it keeps the canyon in a way that really feels timeless in a way, or feels like a bubble. And there's very little kind of curious like rubs between nature and culture. Does that make sense? I feel like it's this pristine landscape that isn't probably that much different than how Powell saw it, in many, many sections. And I know, of course, we've got the reservoirs that have taken a lot of that out, but now I'm in this landscape that looks like a lot like the 1800s. Where do I find content? Where do I find a story? How do I put aside what I've been working on for 30 years and kind of come up with a new way of representing things? That's one question that I have for myself. The other thing is compositionally, this is very different. I was raised on the coast. You saw me out there on the Great Plains. I like a really low horizon. I like to be able to see distances. Now I've got horizon lines that I can't even figure out where they go. I mean, the compositions go straight up and then flatten out and then go up some more. So just my way of pictorially organizing compositions is a challenge for me. And then also, like I said earlier, this is such a collaborative effort. And I'm so used to just being like your typical painter, which are different than printmakers and ceramics that have to share studios and kilns and things like that. You just go out, nobody tells you what to do, you try to come up with something, you go back to your studio, you turn on lights, you rock out, and you try to make meaning out of something without any kind of interaction with anybody else. SCREE is very collaborative. Every breakfast, every dinner, every boat, everything has to be landed. And so you always want to make sure that you're reaching out and telling stories and helping out. So that's a very, very different. And then camping and creating is a difficult thing to do as well. There's so much setup time and things to be concerned about besides making artwork that even the timing for our last Grand Canyon trip, it was difficult to get set up and find something that's interesting and also be a good team player for the rest of the group that you're floating with. This is an image of me with a wet plate that Bailey Russell took of me on the side of the Colorado River working in a pretty intense windstorm. So these are some paintings that I've done along the river. This is the Gates of Lodore. It's a Mexican hat on the San Juan. So these are field drawings, and then they eventually kind of turned into these kind of oil paintings. This is Steamboat Rock in Dinosaur that I produced since last summer's trip with Dan. Full Moon in Jasper Canyon. So these paintings are quite a bit smaller. These are 30 by 22. So I'm working on my vertical compositions, you can see. This is in Stillwater. And then I took a trip down to the Hoover Dam over Christmas break to try to learn a little bit more about that country, and spent the night, of course, in Laughlin Casino at about 20 floors up, and kept an eye on the river. All of that was important to me. Bullhead City has this great wall that says, "God bless the USA." At the time, the weather was about like it is now, and that was when the government shutdown was happening, and the sky in that area just looked like it was bruised and really, really brooding. And this "God bless the USA" wall seemed like it stood out in an interesting way. This is a pretty small little painting here. I'd like to expand it. So this is kind of examples of the research that I've been doing before setting off for tomorrow. Other artists that we've invited to be on the SCREE exhibition is what I'm going to talk about next. We quickly learned about Kate Atkinson, who I've never actually met in person, but had heard about, and then heard that she was nice and heard that she was willing to collaborate with us. And so we reached out to her. She was finishing up at RISD in Rhode Island, but also was building a house and getting married in Bluff, and does really excellent work. She's a printmaker, so we definitely wanted to try to bring as many different medias in. Printmaking is really important with selling the West because of things like Scribner's. And Moran did a lot of printmaking as well as painting and drawing. So this is I believe a monoprint. But what her work is that's mostly exciting is these woodcuts and this is just a section of an overall woodcut, and I'm going to kind of explain it. Like I said, she lives down in the Bears Ears country, and she makes these landscapes that flip from being like representations of the canyon walls, but then also give you bird's eye view, and you can kind of fly above the landscape as well as being in the canyons. So I think compositionally, she's handling these things in a really interesting way, and she's also including uranium mines and dams and things like that. So I believe the thing that, when I think about the SCREE artists, is what we're doing in general is we're reflecting back on the last 150th year and saying, what does Manifest Destiny look like? What have we got here right now? So it's interesting to think that we're going to start to try to think about 150 years into the future, when all of our work now is just kind of looking at what Manifest Destiny has landed us. So what Kate has done and where woodcuts come from are she went to the Santa Fe Art Institute, got a scholarship there for a semester or for a year that they wanted to focus on water conservation, and she carved panels of the San Juan River, pulled prints off of those panels, and then built this drift boat. So if you can look really closely, you can see that these are plates of a print. So she created a drift boat out of she can pull prints off the side of her drift boat. Really beautiful. She built the drift boat with some guys in Flagstaff, I believe, and they did it in 14 hours. She pulled all the prints and then built this boat and then got it on the San Juan. Brandon Gellis is a colleague at the University of Wyoming. He's a graphic designer. We were interested in bringing in his knowledge about new technology. So we wanted somebody to look and think about representing the landscape in a way that wasn't such traditional. And so, but his work's really hard to photograph too, especially in this case. These are plexiglass plates that hang off of the wall, and each one of the plexiglass plates has a laser etch kind of image of a landscape on there. So what he's done in many cases is taken the drawings of William Holmes, and which are really highly detailed drawings, and he's deconstructed them and pulled the landscape apart in a way that creates these negative spaces and kind of reutilizes them in a way, I think, commenting on a lot like what Jason was talking about, is how we kind of impose rules and laws and kind of deconstruct the landscape into our purposes.
If you look through them,
yeah, it collapses. Yeah, and there's one at the museum, I believe. Yeah, so Dave's like, hey, we got one. So it doesn't photograph very well, but it's up at the Sweetwater Museum. I believe that's downstairs, right? Do you hang it downstairs? Yeah. So check them out. And this is another example. And I don't think this is necessarily landscapes from the canyon, but I thought I'd throw this in because it has some color and give you an idea of how those plates interact with each other. David Jones, who was here yesterday, who's the artist that I probably worked with the most, and he's been a great friend. He's a colleague at the University of Wyoming, came from Georgia, and is still just exploring the West little by little. I took him to Green River, Utah, and my God, it's like having a 5-year-old, because he's just like, I can't believe it. I can't get my head around any of this, man. Like, what the heck? He was so excited. It was so cool. You know how the San Rafael swell is just a mind bender to me, but he'd never even seen it. So he's a lot of fun to work with, and I appreciate his artwork. He makes little models of kind of that are inspired by places like on the outskirts of the 8,000 ghost towns that Dan was talking about yesterday. So he's interested in how economy can affect the landscape and how boom and bust cycles come and go, and a lot of times the bus cycle goes and we're just left with what's ever left behind because nobody has any money to take it away. So things like single wide trailers, this is kind of interesting. This is a spot out in the Great Divide Basin where we camp out. We've set up a camp. We kind of use it as a studio space. It's BLM, and we take full advantage of it. Again, there's my trailer, and this is, you kind of can't see it very well, but right here, Dave Jones is working, and he's actually burning his trailer up. So this isn't an actual trailer. This is a model of a trailer. And so that he built, and we set it up, and then he wanted to complete it with a video. And I believe that video is at the Sweetwater County Museum as well. And so we were waiting it was so great to go to this space and just set up the video equipment and set it up with fireworks and explosive and wait for the timing to be right to finally kind of get his video going. So this is a trailer home that burns up. Erica Osborne is somebody also that is on the expedition. I've appreciated Erica's work. I met her in Santa Fe when I was living there. She was a grad student at the University of New Mexico, a painter who would also take, like myself, side trips away from oil painting to try to think about land in a different way. Also has a deep appreciation for American art history, like myself. When I first started making landscape paintings, I didn't have anybody really to talk to. I was at University of Colorado, and it was kind of like the most uncool thing to do is go out to like western Kansas and make paintings about that, you know? You're living in Boulder. It was like, what are you doing? So I'm kind of excited. It seems like so many people are interested in landscape now, and Erica was one of the first ones. Her paintings are excellent, and this is called Waiting for Moran. This is in Green River, Utah. There's one at the museum here that you want to check it out. She's working a very traditional way with heavy glazes and takes her time and does her jump shots and practice shots and is excellent as far as technique goes. What's so amazing about Waiting for Moran is it's definitely in the Romantic era with these dark brooding clouds and the strong kind of Renaissance light coming through. And there's all of these big tour vans right here. There's even one back there. And they're all sitting watching that sun go down over the canyon, but all kind of inside of their buses experiencing landscape in a protected environment. So she's pretty savvy that way. She's from the Salt Lake area, so she always is interested in the Bingham mine, and one time found it, I guess, with this storm had just come through. You can tell she's always referencing Moran, because Moran's painting was called The Chasm of the Colorado. She calls this the Chasm of Bingham, which is the deepest pit mine, I believe, in the world. You would know at this point, right? It's really deep, and it's still going. They're not stopping anytime soon. Right outside of Salt Lake. Bailey Russell is a colleague also at the University of Wyoming, photographer, and we worked together last year on the Grand Canyon, and he's committed to making wet plate photography like the first images of the canyon. This is pre-Grand Canyon trip, right? I didn't have any of your other trips. So this is familiar to us here in Green River. One story about Bailey's trip down the Grand Canyon. I thought he was really successful. I'm struggling away with my little 10-minute, 15-minute line drawings. Bailey's got a whole dark room that he's setting up with, what's the chemical that smells like ether? Collodion, and just all of this, and you're working with just so much equipment and so many different things to think about. The equipment that he's using says, or he learns that it doesn't like to be hot and it doesn't like to be jostled. And we're going down the Grand Canyon, and like in late July, I'm like, wow, can we put Bailey on a different boat? Every time we go around a horseshoe bend, it'd be like, I'd just be waiting for a big blah! There goes Bailey in the sweat plates. But he was actually really successful. And one thing I like about these photographs is definitely their nod to the first images, but also there's something so moody about these photos that just I find that I can't capture in a painting, which is weird because I should be able to, but it's different. Chip Thomas is another artist that we haven't I've never met, but have been interested in his artwork quite a bit. He lives on the Navajo reservation, and some of you might have seen his work before. He does photography and then creates these big wheat paste installations that he puts on buildings and water storage containers like this. And then a lot of times they're just images of people that live in the area, and then also definitely are taking on content that is important to the region. And if you could look closely here, on the face of this character here, it says something about the issue where they were going to start putting treatment water, in Flagstaff they're going to put treatment water and onto the ski area there. They were going to use that treated water, sewage water, and then make snow out of that. It didn't, I don't think it went through. Do you know if that went through, Tom? It did? So they are doing that. Native people have a problem with that, as the Kachinas and all the spiritual connection with those mountains. So that's an issue that comes up in his work as well. This is another piece that's where he's an MD on the reservation, so he knows about diabetes on the reservation, which is a really big problem. So he's looking very closely at the world around him, making artwork that reflects those kind of issues. Will Wilson is another artist that lives on the Navajo region, or Navajo reservation, and will not be joining us. I believe Chip will be, right? Will be. Okay, cool. Yeah. So Will is definitely very directly connected with the issues on top of the Grand Canyon Rim, especially. These are images of him, and again, I wish these were a little bit bigger, but he's wearing a gas mask, making commentary on all of the problems that come with the uranium mining and the wind blowing that uranium into the air and right onto native peoples. And this is pretty amazing. So he's also playing with pop culture and kind of weaving images of pop culture in with traditional native costumes. So this is, you could tell right here is a stormtrooper mask mixed with very Northwestern style of adornment. So I'm really excited to be able to meet definitely be able to meet with Will. I believe as far as going to the art exhibit, not every one of the exhibitions has the same artwork. Most of it is quite a bit different. Some of the photographs are some repeats, but mostly every exhibition is a different set of works, and not everybody is represented in every single exhibition. Does that make sense? And then this is us, bon voyage. Be happy to answer any questions. Speaking of challenges.